The gavel slammed down with a sound that shattered my world. I watched in disbelief as the auctioneer announced the final bid for my grandfather's 40-acre ranch. $25,000. $25,000 for land that had been in my family for 3 generations. Land that was worth at least $500,000. The woman in the front row smiled as she raised her paddle one final time. Corinne Mitchell, HOA president and the architect of my destruction. She had orchestrated this entire nightmare, and now she was about to steal my inheritance for the price of a cheap car. I tried to stand, to protest, to scream that this was fraud, but the sheriff's deputy placed his hand on my shoulder and pushed me back down. The courtroom felt like it was spinning. My chest tightened as the reality hit me like a freight train. That is when I realized they had just stolen everything my grandfather worked his entire life to build, and I was not even a member of their HOA. The phone call came at 3 in the morning. I knew before I even answered that something terrible had happened. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack while feeding the cattle. He was gone before the paramedics could reach the remote ranch. 3 days later, I sat in the sterile office of his estate attorney, still numb from grief. Mr. Henderson, a kind man with silver hair and tired eyes, slid a thick folder across his mahogany desk. "Your grandfather left you everything," he said softly. "The entire ranch. 40 acres, the farmhouse, all the equipment. He was very specific about wanting you to have it." I stared at the documents, my vision blurring with tears. Grandpa Joe had raised me on that ranch every summer when I was a kid. I learned to ride horses in those pastures, helped him mend fences, and spent countless evenings on the front porch listening to his stories about the old days. "There is just one problem," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice growing tense. "We have received some concerning documents from something called the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. They are claiming your grandfather owed substantial fees and fines." My head snapped up. HOA, that does not make any sense. Grandpa lived on a working ranch. There are no subdivisions out there, no cookie-cutter houses, just farmland and cattle. Mr. Henderson pulled out a stack of official-looking papers. "According to these documents, they have been sending notices for over 3 years. Unpaid assessments, violation fines, something about agricultural aesthetics not meeting community standards." I felt my blood pressure rising. Community standards. He has been ranching that land since before I was born. His father homesteaded there in the 1940s. What community are they talking about? The lawyer adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "That is what we need to find out, because according to this final notice, they have already filed a lien against the property. If these claims are valid, it could complicate your inheritance significantly." I drove out to the ranch that afternoon, my mind racing with questions. The long gravel driveway looked exactly the same as always. The old oak trees that Grandpa had planted when he first bought the land still provided shade for the farmhouse. The red barn where we used to store hay still stood proud against the Texas sky. But something was wrong. Posted on the front gate was a bright yellow notice that made my stomach drop. LIEN notice, MEADOWBROK, HILLS amount OWED, $47,000. I tore the paper from the gate and read it 3 times. $47,000 in unpaid fees, fines, and penalties. Late charges that had been compounding for years. Violations for everything from unapproved agricultural structures to failure to maintain landscaping standards. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the house where I had spent the happiest days of my childhood. The familiar smell of leather and old books should have been comforting, but all I could think about was that yellow paper in my hand. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out over the pastures where Grandpa's cattle still grazed peacefully. In the distance, I could see something that had not been there during my last visit 2 years ago. A massive subdivision sprawled across what used to be the Johnson family farm. Hundreds of identical houses with manicured lawns and perfect driveways stretched to the horizon. That is when it hit me. The HOA had not existed when Grandpa first settled here. They had built their little suburban empire around him, and now they wanted to push him out. Except Grandpa was gone, and I was the one left to fight this battle. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Henderson. I need you to research everything you can about this Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Something about this whole situation stinks, and I am going to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, I drove through the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision for the first time. Row after row of beige and tan houses lined perfectly straight streets with names like Harmony Lane and Serenity Circle. Every lawn was exactly the same shade of green. Every mailbox was the regulation black with white numbers. Every driveway was spotless. It was like driving through a suburban nightmare, where individuality had been murdered by committee. I pulled up to the HOA office, a bland building that looked like every other structure in the development. The receptionist, a woman with a fake smile and dead eyes, directed me to a conference room where I would meet with the board. That is when I first laid eyes on Corinne Mitchell. She was exactly what you would expect from an HOA president who had nothing better to do than terrorize her neighbors. Mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She wore a navy blue blazer that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," and she carried herself like she owned the entire world. "You must be Joseph's grandson," she said, extending a manicured hand that felt cold and lifeless. "I am so sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was quite a character." The way she said "character" made it clear she did not mean it as a compliment. "Thank you," I replied, taking a seat across from her and two other board members who looked like they had been cut from the same suburban mold. "I am here to discuss these violation notices. I do not understand how my grandfather's ranch could be subject to HOA rules." Corinne's smile widened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Oh, that is a common misconception. You see, when our community was developed, the county updated the zoning boundaries to include all properties within a 5-mile radius. Your grandfather's ranch falls well within our jurisdiction." She slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of all the notices we sent to Mr. Joseph over the past 3 years. As you can see, we tried repeatedly to work with him, but he was quite stubborn." I opened the folder and felt my jaw drop. Notice after notice, each one more ridiculous than the last. A $500 fine for having non-approved agricultural structures, because his barn was red instead of earth-tone colors. A $1,000 penalty for failure to maintain front yard landscaping, because he had native wildflowers instead of St. Augustine grass. The most absurd violation was a $2,000 fine for disruption of community aesthetics, because his cattle were visible from the main road. "This is insane," I said, my voice rising. "You are fining him for having cattle on a cattle ranch. He has been ranching this land for 40 years. Corinne's expression did not change. "Community standards exist for a reason, Mr. Johnson. Property values depend on everyone doing their part to maintain the quality of life our residents expect." "But he is not your resident." I slammed the folder shut. "His property was here first. Your subdivision built around him." The man to Karen's left, who had introduced himself as the treasurer, cleared his throat. Actually, according to county records, all properties within the designated area automatically fall under HOA governance when the association is established. Your grandfather received proper notification. I stared at him in disbelief. So you are telling me that just because you built a subdivision nearby, you automatically get to control what he does with his own land? That is correct, Karen said smoothly. And since Mr. Joseph chose to ignore our reasonable requests for compliance, the outstanding balance has grown to $47,000, with interest and penalties, of course. She leaned forward, and her voice took on a predatory tone. Now, I understand this puts you in a difficult position. Inheriting property with such substantial debt can be overwhelming, but I want you to know that Meadowbrook Hills Development Company would be willing to make you a fair offer for the land. My blood ran cold. Development company. Oh yes, Karen smiled. My husband owns the company. We specialize in converting outdated agricultural properties into modern residential communities. We could take this burden off your hands and give you enough money to start fresh somewhere else. That is when I realized this had been their plan all along. They had not been trying to force Grandpa to comply with their rules. They had been building a legal case to steal his land. The violations, the fines, the compound interest. It was all designed to create enough debt to justify seizing the property. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Karen's smile was now openly predatory. Given the outstanding debt and the condition of the structures, we could offer $25,000, cash. You could have this whole mess behind you by next week. $25,000 for 40 acres of prime Texas ranch land. It was insulting beyond belief. I stood up slowly, fighting to keep my composure. I will need time to think about this. Of course, Karen said, but do not wait too long. The longer this drags on, the more expensive it becomes for everyone involved. As I walked back to my truck, I could feel her eyes watching me through the conference room window. She thought she had me cornered. She thought I would roll over and accept her pathetic offer, just like she probably expected my grandfather to do. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I spent the next week researching everything I could about property law and HOA regulations. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The legal system had been systematically corrupted to favor developers and HOAs over individual property owners. Mr. Henderson arranged for me to meet with Margaret Torres, a property rights attorney with 20 years of experience fighting HOA overreach. Her office was cluttered with legal books and case files, and she had the tired look of someone who had seen too many good people destroyed by bureaucratic corruption. Your case is unfortunately not unique, she said after reviewing my documents. Over the past decade, we have seen a dramatic increase in what I call annexation by HOA. Developers create these associations with broad powers, then use friendly county officials to expand their jurisdiction. She pulled out a thick file. I have been tracking similar cases across 3 counties. In every instance, rural properties get surrounded by development, then absorbed into HOA control through dubious legal mechanisms. But how is that legal? I asked. How can they just declare authority over land they do not own? Margaret's expression darkened. Money and political connections. The developers contribute heavily to county commissioner campaigns, donate to judges' re-election funds, and hire former county employees as consultants. It is all perfectly legal, but it stinks to high heaven. She opened the file and showed me case after case of rural landowners who had lost their properties to similar schemes. Farms that had been in families for generations, seized for unpaid HOA fees that the owners never agreed to pay. The worst part, Margaret continued, is that once they establish the debt, the foreclosure process is fast-tracked. County judges who owe their positions to developer money rubber-stamp these cases without proper examination. My heart sank. So what are my options? We fight, she said firmly. But I have to warn you, this will not be easy or cheap. We are going up against people with deep pockets and political influence. 2 weeks later, we were in court for the preliminary hearing. Judge Harrison looked like he would rather be anywhere else as he shuffled through the paperwork. The HOA's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Caldwell, presented their case with the confidence of someone who had won this fight many times before. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, "this is a straightforward matter of unpaid assessments and violation fines. The defendant's grandfather was properly notified of HOA jurisdiction and chose to ignore his legal obligations." He handed the judge a stack of documents. "These are certified copies of all notices sent to the property owner over a 3-year period. As you can see, Mr. Joseph was given numerous opportunities to comply or appeal the violations." Margaret stood to respond. "Your Honor, we dispute the validity of the HOA's jurisdiction over this property. The ranch predates the subdivision by 40 years and was never part of any planned development." Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork. "Counselor, county records clearly show the property falls within the established HOA boundaries. The jurisdiction question was settled when the association was incorporated." "But Your Honor," Margaret pressed, "our research indicates those boundary changes were made without proper notification to affected property owners." "The court finds that proper notice was given according to county procedures," the judge said in a bored tone. "Do you have evidence that your client's grandfather never received the violation notices?" That is when Caldwell played his trump card. "Your Honor, we have here a signed acknowledgement form from Mr. Joseph, dated 18 months ago, confirming receipt of HOA governing documents and agreeing to comply with community standards." He handed a document to the judge, then passed a copy to Margaret. I watched her face go white as she read it. "Your Honor," she said, her voice strained, "we need time to examine this document. This is the first time we have seen this alleged acknowledgement." Judge Harrison glanced at his watch. "The document appears to be properly notarized and filed with the county. Unless you have evidence of forgery, I am inclined to accept it as valid." I grabbed Margaret's arm. "That is not Grandpa's signature," I whispered urgently. "I have seen his handwriting my whole life. That is not how he signed his name." Margaret tried to get the judge's attention. "Your Honor, we request a handwriting analysis of this document. Our client believes the signature may be fraudulent." "Motion denied," Judge Harrison said without hesitation. "The document is properly notarized, which creates a presumption of validity. If you want to challenge it, you can file a separate motion." My heart was pounding as I realized what was happening. They had forged my grandfather's signature, and the judge was refusing to even look at the evidence. The whole system was rigged. "Your Honor," Caldwell continued, "given the defendant's acknowledgement of HOA authority and the substantial unpaid debt, we request immediate approval of the lien and authorization to proceed with foreclosure proceedings." "Granted," Judge Harrison said, banging his gavel. "The lien is valid and enforceable. The property may be sold to satisfy the debt in accordance with state foreclosure laws." As we walked out of the courthouse, Margaret looked defeated. "I am sorry," she said. I have never seen a judge move that fast on a foreclosure case. Usually, we get at least 60 days to prepare our defense. I felt like I had been sucker punched. So what happens now? They can schedule the auction in as little as 30 days, she replied. And given the way this hearing went, I do not think we can expect a fair fight in this county. That night, I sat on Grandpa's front porch and stared out at the land that had been in our family for 3 generations. In 30 days, it would belong to Corinne Mitchell and her development company. They would tear down the house, bulldoze the barn, and turn 40 acres of Texas ranch land into another cookie-cutter subdivision. Unless I found a way to stop them. The auction notice appeared in the local newspaper exactly 30 days later. Foreclosure sale, 40 acres, improved property minimum bid $25,000. $20 $5,000 for land that any legitimate appraiser would value at $500,000 or more. I called Margaret immediately. How is this legal? The minimum bid does not even cover the supposed debt, let alone the actual value of the property. Her voice was heavy with frustration. They set the minimum bid to match their purchase offer. It is designed to ensure no legitimate buyers can compete with their predetermined price. But surely other people will show up to bid on 40 acres at that price. Not if they know what is good for them, Margaret said darkly. These auctions are usually attended only by insiders and their associates. Anyone else who tries to bid tends to face mysterious problems with financing or legal challenges to their bids. The morning of the auction, I arrived at the courthouse steps to find exactly what Margaret had predicted. Only 5 people were present besides the auctioneer and court officials. I recognized Corinne Mitchell and her husband Brad, a man who looked like he had spent his entire life bulldozing things that other people loved. The other 3 bidders were clearly associates of the development company. They stood in a tight group, occasionally whispering to each other and glancing at me with undisguised hostility. The auctioneer, a thin man with a nervous disposition, called the proceedings to order. We are here for the foreclosure sale of 40 acres improved property, legally described as. He rattled off a string of survey coordinates that meant nothing to anyone except lawyers and land developers. Minimum bid is $25,000. Do I hear 25? Corinne raised her paddle immediately. 25,000. 25,000. Do I hear 30? Silence. The other bidders made no move to raise their paddles. 25,000 once, 25,000 twice. 30,000, I shouted, raising my hand. Every head turned to stare at me. Corinne's face went red with anger, and her husband looked like he wanted to physically remove me from the courthouse steps. 30,000 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said nervously. Do I hear 35? Corinne whispered something to her husband, then raised her paddle again. 35,000. 40,000, I called out. This continued for several more rounds, with Corinne and her associates taking turns bidding against me. But something strange was happening. Instead of the competitive bidding frenzy you would expect for such valuable property, they seemed to be following a script designed to discourage me from continuing. When the bidding reached $60,000, one of the anonymous bidders suddenly raised his paddle. 100,000. The message was clear. They could outbid me all day if necessary, but they preferred to discourage me from wasting their time. I looked at Margaret, who was standing nearby with a defeated expression. We both knew I could not compete with unlimited developer money, especially when the entire process was rigged in their favor. 100,000 once, 100,000 twice, sold to bidder number 4 for $100,000. I felt like the world was collapsing around me. Not only had they stolen my grandfather's land, but they had done it right in front of me while I stood helpless to stop them. But then something even more outrageous happened. "Excuse me," the winning bidder called out to the auctioneer. "I need to withdraw my bid due to financing issues that just came up." The auctioneer looked confused. "Sir, you cannot withdraw a winning bid at a foreclosure auction." Karen's husband stepped forward. "Actually, according to state law, a bidder has 24 hours to secure financing or forfeit their bid. Since this gentleman is having financing problems, the sale should go to the second highest bidder." I could not believe what I was hearing. They had planted a fake bidder to drive up the price and eliminate any competition, then had him withdraw so they could buy the property at their original lowball price. "That is fraud," I shouted. "This whole auction is a sham." The sheriff's deputy, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly took an interest in our conversation. "Sir, I am going to need you to lower your voice and step back." "They are stealing my family's land," I protested. "This is organized fraud and you are helping them do it." "Sir, if you do not calm down, I will have to place you under arrest for disrupting a legal proceeding." I looked around at the faces staring at me. Karen was smiling like she had just won the lottery. Her husband was checking something on his phone, probably coordinating with the bulldozer crews. The fake bidder was walking away like nothing had happened. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "In accordance with state foreclosure procedures, the property is awarded to the second highest bidder, Meadowbrook Hills Development Company, for the sum of $35,000. $35,000. They had just bought my grandfather's 40-acre ranch for the price of a used pickup truck. The purchaser has 10 days to complete the transaction and take possession of the property," the auctioneer announced. "This concludes today's proceedings." As the crowd dispersed, Karen walked over to where I was standing in stunned silence. "I want you to know there are no hard feelings," she said with fake sympathy. "Business is business, but I do hope you will be reasonable about the transition. We would like to take possession as soon as possible." I stared at her, trying to find words that could express the rage and betrayal I was feeling. "You forged my grandfather's signature. You corrupted the legal process. You rigged the auction. How do you sleep at night?" Her mask of fake sympathy slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Prove it," she said quietly. Then her smile returned. "We will be in touch about the move-out timeline." 10 days later, I loaded the last of my grandfather's belongings into my pickup truck. The sheriff's deputy stood nearby to ensure I did not cause any trouble as Karen's crew prepared to demolish everything Grandpa had built. As I drove away from the ranch for what I thought might be the last time, I could see the bulldozers in my rearview mirror. They were already tearing down the barn where I had learned to ride horses and helped Grandpa store hay every summer. But as I watched my family's legacy disappear behind a cloud of dust and diesel smoke, I made a promise to myself and to Grandpa's memory. This was not over, not by a long shot. The first thing I did after losing the ranch was hire a private investigator. Sarah Chen was a former FBI agent who specialized in white-collar crime and public corruption. Her office was spartanly furnished, but her wall was covered with newspaper clippings about successful prosecutions she had helped build. "Your case has all the hallmarks of organized fraud," she said after reviewing my documents. "But if we are going to prove it, we need to dig deeper than just your grandfather's property." Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah and I methodically investigated Karen Mitchell and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. What we discovered was far worse than I had imagined. Karen and her husband Brad own not just one development company, but a network of shell corporations spread across 5 counties. Each company specialized in targeting rural properties for forced acquisition through HOA liens and foreclosure sales. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, spreading county records across her desk. Over the past 8 years, they have seized 43 properties using the exact same playbook. Rural land gets surrounded by development, absorbed into HOA control, then foreclosed for unpaid fees. The documentation was staggering. Farm after farm, ranch after ranch, all lost to the same fraudulent scheme. Families who had worked their land for generations, driven out by fabricated debt and corrupted legal proceedings. "Here is the really interesting part," Sarah continued, pulling out a financial analysis. "Every single one of these properties was purchased at foreclosure for well below market value, then immediately rezoned for high-density residential development. The profits are enormous." I studied the numbers and felt sick. They are not just stealing property, they are destroying entire communities and ways of life for profit. "Gets worse," Sarah said, opening another file. "I tracked the money flowing through their various companies. Substantial payments to county commissioners, campaign contributions to judges, consulting contracts with former planning department employees. This is systematic corruption." But the smoking gun came when Sarah managed to get access to Karen's business emails through a contact at the phone company. Hidden in hundreds of mundane messages about subdivision planning and permit applications was evidence of the conspiracy I had suspected all along. "Read this one," Sarah said, pointing to an email dated 6 months before my grandfather's death. The message was from Karen to her husband. "The Johnson Ranch is perfect for Phase 3 expansion. The old man is getting weaker and his grandson does not visit much anymore. I think we can accelerate the timeline. Have Caldwell prepare the documentation." Another email, sent just 2 weeks later. Henderson at the county clerk's office confirmed he can backdate the boundary expansion paperwork. Cost is $15,000, same as the others. My hands were shaking as I read message after message detailing their criminal enterprise. They had been planning to steal Grandpa's ranch for over a year before he died. The violation notices, the compound interest, even the forged signature document. It had all been carefully orchestrated. "This is enough to bring federal charges," Sarah said. "Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, public corruption, the whole criminal enterprise." But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah traced the network of victims. She had compiled a list of 43 families who had lost their properties to Karen's scheme, and she suggested I try to contact some of them to build a coalition for legal action. The first person I called was Maria Gonzalez, whose family farm had been seized 18 months earlier. She answered the phone with the wary voice of someone who had been through hell and was not eager to relive it. "Yes, I remember the foreclosure," she said when I explained who I was. "We lost everything. 80 acres that my great-grandfather homesteaded in 1923. They claimed we owed $60,000 in HOA fees for having chickens and a vegetable garden." "I am so sorry," I said. "I had no idea there were so many other victims." "Victims?" Maria's voice turned bitter. "That is what we are, all right. But nobody cares when it happens to working people trying to hold onto family land. The newspapers do not write stories about us." I called 6 more families over the next 2 days. Every story was the same. Rural properties surrounded by development, absorbed into HOA control through dubious legal procedures, then foreclosed for fabricated debt. Families destroyed, communities torn apart. Also, Corinne and Brad Mitchell could build more cookie-cutter subdivisions. The most heartbreaking call was with Robert Hayes, an elderly rancher whose property had been seized just 3 months earlier. 40 years I raised cattle on that land, he said, his voice breaking. My wife and I built our house with our own hands back in 1981. They tore it down the day after the foreclosure sale, did not even give us time to get her grandmother's china out of the hutch. Where are you living now? I asked. Trailer park outside town. At our age, we cannot get another mortgage, and we do not have family to help. That woman destroyed our whole life for her profit margins. By the end of the week, Sarah and I had documented a criminal enterprise that had stolen over $3 million worth of property from working families. We had emails proving conspiracy, financial records showing systematic bribery, and a pattern of fraud that stretched across multiple counties. The question now, Sarah said, is what do we do with all this evidence? I thought about my grandfather's ranch, now being turned into another suburban wasteland. I thought about Maria Gonzalez and Robert Hayes and all the other families whose lives had been destroyed. I thought about the corrupt judges and county officials who had enabled this criminal enterprise for years. We burned their whole operation to the ground, I said, every last piece of it. Sarah smiled for the first time since I had hired her. Now you are talking my language. Sarah and I spent the next month building an airtight case against Corinne Mitchell and her criminal network. But we knew that going through the local courts would be pointless. The same judges who had rubber-stamped the fraudulent foreclosures would never convict the people who had been bribing them. We need to go federal, Sarah explained. The mail fraud and wire fraud charges give us federal jurisdiction. Plus, the systematic corruption of local officials makes this a perfect case for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. She had contacts at the Bureau from her days as an agent, and she arranged a meeting with Special Agent Mike Rodriguez, who headed the white-collar crime division for the regional office. Rodriguez was a serious man in his 40s who listened to our presentation without interruption. When we finished laying out the evidence, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. This is one of the most comprehensive fraud schemes I have seen in 15 years, he said. The documentation is excellent, and the pattern of corruption is clear. But I have to warn you, prosecuting local officials and real estate developers is politically sensitive work. These people have destroyed dozens of families, I said. They have stolen millions of dollars in property through systematic fraud. Politics should not matter. Rodriguez nodded. You are right, but it helps that your evidence is so strong. Give me 2 weeks to present this to the U.S. Attorney's Office and get approval for a full investigation. While we waited for federal law enforcement to act, Sarah and I implemented the other part of our plan. She had identified an investigative journalist named Tom Parker who worked for the regional newspaper and specialized in exposing government corruption. Tom was exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent 20 years digging up dirt on crooked politicians. Rumpled clothes, skeptical expression, and the kind of persistent personality that made corrupt officials lose sleep at night. This is bigger than just real estate fraud, he said after reviewing our evidence. This is systematic destruction of rural communities by connected developers. My readers are going to be furious when they see this story. Tom spent 3 weeks interviewing victims, reviewing public records, and building a comprehensive exposé of Corinne's criminal enterprise. The story was scheduled to run on a Sunday, ensuring maximum readership and impact. But before the story could be published, Agent Rodriguez called with news that made my heart race. "We have approval for a full investigation," he said. "Tomorrow morning, we are executing search warrants on Corinne Mitchell's home, her business offices, and the homes of 3 county officials. We are also freezing the assets of all associated development companies." I could barely contain my excitement. "Does this mean you are going to arrest them?" "If the evidence supports it, yes. But I want you to understand that this is just the beginning. Building a federal case takes time, and these people have expensive lawyers. Do not expect immediate justice." The next morning, I drove to the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision and parked across the street from Corinne's house. At exactly 6 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up to her front door. FBI agents in tactical gear surrounded the house while others approached with search warrant in hand. I watched through binoculars as Corinne answered the door in her bathrobe, her perfectly styled hair disheveled and her face white with shock. The lead agent handed her the warrant and politely pushed past her into the house. For the next 4 hours, agents carried box after box of documents, computer equipment, and financial records out of Corinne's house. I had never seen anything so satisfying in my entire life. At the same time, Tom Parker's exposé hit the newspaper stands and the internet. The headline read, "Land Grab: How Local HOA Queen Stole Millions in Rural Property Through Systematic Fraud." The story was devastating. Tom had interviewed 12 victim families, documented the pattern of corruption with public records, and exposed the network of bribes and political connections that had enabled the scheme. By noon, the story was being shared thousands of times on social media, and local television stations were scrambling to follow up. Corinne's world was collapsing in real time. The county commissioners who had taken her bribes were bombarded with calls for their resignation. The judges who had rubber-stamped her fraudulent foreclosures found themselves under investigation by the State Judicial Conduct Commission. The HOA board members who had participated in the scheme were facing lawsuits from their own homeowners. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later when Agent Rodriguez called to tell me that Corinne Mitchell had been arrested. Federal charges include conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, he said. Her husband and 3 county officials were also arrested. Bond has been set at $500,000 each. I drove to the county jail that afternoon and sat in the parking lot, just thinking about everything that had happened. 6 months earlier, I had been a grieving grandson trying to honor my grandfather's memory by preserving the family ranch. Now I was the key witness in a federal corruption case that would put Corinne Mitchell in prison for years. The local news was covering the arrests as their lead story. Video footage showed Corinne being led away in handcuffs, her perfect suburban image replaced by an orange jumpsuit and leg shackles. But the real victory came 2 weeks later when Agent Rodriguez called with news I had never dared to hope for. "The federal court has ordered restitution for all victims of the fraud scheme," he said. "Your grandfather's ranch is being returned to you, along with damages for the illegal foreclosure. The Mitchell Development Company is being liquidated to pay victim compensation." I sat in stunned silence, barely able to process what he was telling me. "Are you saying I get the ranch back?" "That is exactly what I am saying. Full title, clear of all liens, plus compensation for your legal expenses and the damage they did to the property."